In this lecture, I want to pause, in a manner of speaking, between Plato and Aristotle for a separate lecture on Hippocrates and Greek medicine in general, and that for several reasons worth recounting at the outset. Chronologically, the dates for Hippocrates of Kos are just about the same as Socrates' own dates, approximately 469 BC for his birth. We're not quite sure when Hippocrates was born, but it must have been very close to 469, and with more confidence, the date of his death being 399. So he overlaps nearly perfectly with Socrates. Second, the movement from Plato and the Academy to Aristotle is a movement very much in the direction of natural science, and a natural science perspective on the nature of things. And Greek medicine had much to do with promoting that perspective. Third, and as is well known, Aristotle's father was a physician, and I'm inclined to think that in all the subjects that Aristotle developed and mastered and invented, he was most at home with the biological disciplines, although he did not pursue a professional career in medicine. Finally, the school of Hippocrates and Greek medicine in general provide us with a clearer picture of what it means to analyze and secularize and naturalize a subject which in other cultures and civilizations generally was subsumed under and even answerable to religion, priestcraft, magic, superstition. In this respect, I don't think one would be guilty of hyperbole in declaring the ancient Greek medical perspective almost a miracle of types. It is virtually without precedent when you examine the ancient medical writings on diseases and disorders. They are often astonishingly close to what we would take to be a contemporary view of things. The widest range of disorders, including epilepsy, seizures, bouts of madness, perceptual and motor deficits, are thoroughly bound up with conditions of the body, with diet, with hereditary predispositions, with traumatic injuries. What is so remarkable about this is that if you look at any other age, even the great age of Egyptian medicine, medical views are inseparable from religious beliefs and customs, which is to say, with what is, to put the matter in a descriptive but respectful way, mystical and even superstitious perspectives. In this light, we can say that one of the great ideas, as it were, in the history of ideas, is the idea that the conditions of health and disease, whatever form the diseases take, are to be understood in a naturalistic, systematic, scientific way. If that's not a great idea in philosophy, I want to see what is. Philosophy in the broader sense. Here, Greek medicine is tracking something that is already present in Hellenic thought. Indeed, it's already present in Homer. Homer, you will recall, tends to account for the behavior of heroes in terms of conditions taking place in their bodies. The death scenes in Iliad are so graphic in describing precisely which organs fall out, and when the sword has been removed, the graphic elements in Iliad are graphic to the point of being ghoulish. But more than simply reporting how death is attendant upon particular destruction of organs and systems within the body, there is also the psychobiological form of explanation that the Homeric epics provide, telling us why someone is driven or possessed. One is guided by thumos or epithumia, by lusa, the wolf's rage. And these always have reference to something taking place where? In the body. So there's already, as early as the Homeric epics, a naturalistic tendency in the matter of how one is to explain significant human undertakings. With Pythagoras, of course, we have a philosopher whose subject is nature, and for all the transcendental elements of Pythagorean thought, there is a Pythagorean school of medicine, and there is great attention paid to the health of the body and to the bodily regimens, because after all, the body is the house of the soul, and there's a communication between the two, such that one can, in fact, corrupt one's spiritual nature corporeally, This is what's behind the vegetarianism of the sect, its ritual performances, its therapeutic regimen. You treat the soul through musical harmonies, through the right dietary regimen, the right exercises. You treat the soul by treating the body. So I say, even with Pythagoras, who surely would be the most transcendental of the medical or quasi-medical practitioners of 6th century BC, there is this hefty dose of naturalistic thinking. Now I want to get behind the naturalism to what I submit impels naturalism and a naturalistic outlook. In a truly remarkable way, Hellenic civilization objectified itself. Hellenic civilization took itself, its central values, its core beliefs, its most committed desires and aspirations as a culture, both at the level of the polis and the level of the person, and externalized all this, objectified it for the purpose of critical scrutiny. This is not a natural sort of thing to do, which is probably why it took so long for it to happen at all. And here I return briefly to the question, what is philosophy, and did the Greeks invent it? Think for a moment about how we go through life as subjects of our own experiences. The thoughts we have are the thoughts we have. There's not something external whispering to us about these thoughts. They are just thoughts, and desires, and motives. We do not stop in our tracks at a certain point and say, wait, I shall treat all this as if it were out there. I'm going to take these desires and thoughts and beliefs and convictions, and I'm going to undertake a critical examination of the entire process, and similarly with events arising in my own body. I say this is not the common sense tendency or customary in any way across cultures. It is a process of objectification and of the secularizing of knowledge. In this, it is in vivid contrast to such insights and understandings based on revelation, based on the wisdom of prophets, the canons of a religious faith. For the Hippocratic physician, as with his contemporaries in philosophy, contemporaries in mathematics and the natural sciences, there is no scriptural authority, no priestly hermeneutic, no divine voice that will settle matters once and for all. The view instead calls for us to externalize things, put them in the only world that is accessible to us, which is the natural world, and view them as facts to be explored. Regarding the Hippocratic medicine, what comes down to us in the form of Hippocratic writing, the corpus of Hippocratic writing certainly was not put together by Hippocrates himself. These are treatises that were developed over a period of time. Whether he wrote any of them remains unsettled. However, that the writings indeed are richly indebted to Hippocrates' teachings, there is no doubt. So let me refer then to Hippocratic writings rather than to what Hippocrates might have said or written. Consider now how the Hippocratic physicians understood what their contemporaries referred to as, quote, the sacred disease, for this is characteristic of the perspective and the achievements of the Hippocratic school. The Hippocratic physicians are not skeptical about religion and the gods, not at all. Rather, they're skeptical about understanding health and disease in the idiom of the sacred. Thus, when the question is taken up as to the nature of the so-called sacred disease, the Hippocratic writers are not saying, well, there are no gods, therefore there are no sacred diseases. No, they're saying, well, look, religious teaching tells us that the gods are capable of producing anything and everything. Therefore, there's no one disease that's any more divine than any other. So in a manner of speaking, you can hold the religious account constant because these will figure indifferently in everything. Therefore, there's no point in singling out one kind of disorder and saying, the gods are the ones responsible for that, or that one is bequeathed directly or inflicted directly by the Olympians. Now, this perspective becomes a perspective available only to those who have not accepted priestcraft as having epistemological authority. Whatever problems are to be addressed by oracles and priests, the problem of knowledge is not one of them, at least as this problem arises from the facts of the natural world. And I do want to underscore this. It is a point worth repeating. Something momentous takes place when a culture takes the position that the problem of knowledge is essentially a religious problem and invests its credulity in a denominated group of official interpreters whose judgments on matters of this kind are taken to be incorrigible. Here I do not presume to weigh the claims of religion and the claims of the secular world. My own guess is that for every secularly produced fact, there may be some profound religious truth on which it depends. But here the complexity of the case and the shortness of life incline me at any rate to silence. What I am testing instead are the implications that follow depending upon which of the positions is taken as a person or culture sets out to solve problems arising from life in the real world. Once one confers on a select and denominated group ultimate epistemological authority on core questions arising from the problem of knowledge, the nearly inevitable result is philosophical paralysis. And what is more likely to happen is positions will become quite hardened, and the only thing left for scholarship is to interpret the words of the wise. So the entire debate now is not a debate about the nature of truth, but about how a text or holy maxim is to be understood. What the leaders of thought in the ancient Greek world might be inclined to say is that this may be the best way to get to heaven, but surely not to the moon. The Hellenic world was scarcely, devoid of religious influences on all aspects of thought and practice. No question about it. Religion is a central fact of ancient Greek life. Consider again Pythagoras, who was a man of great spiritual devotion, a man whose mathematics is seeking to rise to the level of the divine. In Homer as well, whether it is Lusa or Thumos or anything else invading the body, Homer leaves ample room for the realm of spirit to operate, and to operate powerfully according to its own principles, these being obscure, powerful, and chthonic. I said in an earlier lecture that the ancient Greek world never had an official religion, but was also never an entirely secular world either. There is a remarkable integration of the secular and the religious in this robust and flourishing culture in the 5th and early 4th centuries BC. Nonetheless, the Hippocrates give us a particularly useful example of a science that is liberated from religious orthodoxies, an example matched by the productive scholarship of that same period in natural science, political science, psychology, and associated subjects. This is not to say that Hippocratic medicine was superior to what might have been found in Egypt, even 500 or 1,000 years earlier, but it is to say that it was based on an entirely different set of presuppositions. Now, throughout these lectures, and in philosophy in general, there's a term that's quite commonly used to identify a particular approach to the problem of knowledge. The term is, quote, empirical. We often hear that one is engaged in empirical research. We describe a philosopher as being an empiricist. We say that science is an essentially empirical enterprise. Now, what do we mean when we use this word? Empirical is grounded in the ancient Greek word empireia, which simply means observation. Now, the Hippocratic physicians describe themselves as empirikoi, each one of them being an empirikos. In this, they meant to convey that their remedies were based on what had been observed to be effective, not on some grand theory by which remedies are allegedly deducible. Now, today, if a physician is asked about how medical science approaches disease, the reply is likely to be something like, well, the approach of medical science is empirical, meaning based on clinical observations that tell us that when a particular condition is treated in a particular way, certain consequences follow. Those consequences that promote health are taken to be the right kind of therapy, And those consequences that don't do that or make conditions worse are then abandoned. Nowhere in the approach do we find overriding, overarching, non-scientific theories or beliefs driving the entire practice. So when Dr. Hippocrates says, "I am an empirikos," he's contrasting what he's doing with an approach that has one consulting oracles or engaging in certain ritual acts, appealing to priests or holy men to intercede with the gods to relieve symptoms. Needless to say, one who believes that the symptoms themselves have been visited upon the victim, presumably because of something the victim has done, there is little distinction between the concept of illness and that of a just desert. After all, if the gods see fit to punish one directly by imposing some kind of disease on one because of something one has done, well, this almost looks like Olympian justice. As for the notion of disease as evidence of sin, it would be perilous to believe that all this was left behind in remote antiquity. We don't want to exaggerate the richness of the Hippocratic view. Later in these lectures, I'll consider the period 1400 to 1700, when the witch panics and the witch persecutions were common in Europe. And I'll then return to some of the non-scientific, non-medical perspectives on why it is that certain people have certain disorders. But let me just point out here that the witch persecutions went on not only for 300 years, but primarily in periods we describe as a Renaissance, then followed by the Great Age of Science. Witches are being executed in the age of Newton and Galileo and Descartes. This is not only a bleak chapter in social history, but a fairly recent chapter as well. And it draws attention to the very size of that part of the Hellenic achievement which I've referred to as the objectification of the self and the natural world. Now I want to go to yet another period, here now the first several centuries AD, and particularly with respect to those forms of illness that we would describe as mental illness, madness, or forms of illness that seem to attack the spiritual or psychic side of life. Of course, central among these was epilepsy. How do you account for someone falling to the ground and engaging in all sorts of fitful behavior? If anything looks like a visitation from powerful spirits, that does. Now, how a condition like that was understood in the early Christian period really depended on where in the Christian world you were, either Eastern or Western. If in the East, where the influence was primarily the influence of the Hippocratics and Aristotelian science, a condition like epilepsy was understood the way we might regard a viral attack. Well, it's something that happens to people, condition of the body. Indeed, possession was understood in the same way. Witches were understood in the same way. To be possessed was to have, now I'm speaking metaphorically, well, to have a kind of bug. Do you say it's something that could pass with time? Maybe not, could be a persistent bug. If, however, you were positioned within Western Christianity during this early period, which is a much more theory-driven world, indeed a world driven by highly rationalistic understandings of religion and the world itself, then all sorts of hypotheses come to be welded together, very much to the disadvantage of the sufferer, whose condition is likely to be understood as a kind of retribution for wickedness. For example, consider the Salic laws of the 7th century. One is permitted to dissolve his marriage if after marriage one's wife becomes insane. And how is this madness explained by the law, by Salic law? She is mad, and I quote from the Salic law, quote, because of her grave sins. Blaming the victim here is not a thoughtless act, it is a theory-driven act, according to which the body takes on conditions as a result of divine, spiritual, or unnatural influences. And so I say again, the Hippocratic achievement is a central one in the history of ideas. It's part of the larger program of naturalizing the natural world and having us understand it in its own terms. This required uncommon intellectual integrity and discipline. There is a philosophy of medicine behind the Hippocratic medical teachings, and it is Greek philosophy, for at this time there is no other. Now, if one is to promote health and well-being in the body, then one has to raise the question of what it is that controls the affairs of the body. It might be of some interest to note how late in the game it was that naturalistic philosophy actually spoke of organs and systems in the body. There's much talk as early as Homer about certain fluids and humors and things that flow around the body. There's talk about blood everywhere except where the gods are concerned, for their immortal veins are filled with ichor, a distinct advantage, by the way. But even as recently as Aristotle, and Aristotle is one of the pioneering figures in the history of biology and natural science, we don't really have the sense of the body as a collection of integrated systems. He certainly knows about the organs of the body. He's actually done dissections. But we don't get accounts that by today's lights we would call physiological accounts, accounts of integrated systems functioning in a certain way. That actually comes later, and I should think one of the early leading figures in that whole line of thought would be Galen in the 2nd century AD, about whom more will be said later. So I don't want to gild the lily and suggest that this naturalistic Hippocratic perspective was utterly modern. Rather, it is a bridge to the modern. It's a bridge to science. It's the secularization of an enterprise that indeed should be secularized, namely the natural functions of the body in health and disease. The Hippocratics also were quite correct against even such formidable people as Aristotle in identifying the brain as the part of the body in which sensory and rational processes are grounded. The disordered or destroyed or traumatically insulted brain is the condition that reliably gives rise to events that today we would call pathological, sensory losses, the dragging of a leg, a paralyzed limb, blindness, deafness, unconsciousness. In their clinical observations, the Hippocratics actually observed certain structure-function relationships tying the brain to specific sensory, motor, and cognitive abilities. And of course, Aristotle, as we shall see, is finding some of this located more in the chest and in the heart than in the brain. Aristotle famously regarded the mission of the brain to be the regulation of the temperature of the blood. So I sometimes say to students that Aristotle had a very good head on his shoulders, though he tended to think of it as a kind of refrigerator. Today's leaders of thought tend to believe that the brain is essentially a computational device. Now, if I were forced to choose between the computer model and the refrigerator model, I'm not quite sure which one I might find more suspect, but I will leave this for a lecture much later in this course of lectures. Now, the ancient Greek medical writers and practitioners were not a breed apart. They were part of a community of thinkers, naturalistic in their orientation. Whether the topic was politics or ethics, the conduct of daily life, the conduct of foreign affairs, there is a realism here, a kind of common sense realism that we find in the Hellenic world, and that would be rare even today. And this leads me to an observation that can't be stressed enough. The celebrated figures of this age were in a conspicuous minority. Let us recall that Socrates is not made a philosopher king, he's put to death. Aristotle, as it happens, leaves Athens just in time to avoid what probably would have been a similar fate. As Diogenes Laertius will say when asked, "Why are you leaving?" Aristotle allegedly replied, "So that this city will not sin against philosophy a second time." The ancient Greek so-called man in the street is not to be confused with Hippocrates, Aristotle, Sophocles, Euripides, Plato, and the rest. We can satisfy ourselves that this would be an uncommon group in any age. The Athenian citizen is given to mystical beliefs, rank superstitions, prejudices, ritualistic performances that surely would look almost preposterous by contemporary lights. A deep suspicion toward philosophers was played upon by Aristophanes in plays like Clouds, where philosophers are found to be speculating either on what nobody can know or speculating in a way that the man in the street, the so-called rider on the Clapham omnibus, would regard as simply ridiculous. Philosophers were very often held up to scorn. In the developed world of ancient Rome, subject to Greek tutors and Greek high culture, when things take a bad turn, who's exiled? The philosophers. The first thing Romans do is get the philosophers out of town, source of all our problems. So we want to say about this great age of Hellenic philosophy, art, architecture, medicine, and science, that it really is the work of the few. Now you might say, of course, well, inevitably it's the work of the few. How many Newtons are there? But it's not the work of the few, not in the sense that genius is rare, but in the sense that the perspective developed was not widely shared. There is a leavening effect that I would also like to note in this connection. Notwithstanding the observations that I've just summarized, there was also an element of uncommon tolerance in the Hellenic world, perhaps more positive than tolerance. There was a perfectionist ideal that did spread widely through the population, and that resulted in the support of all forms of excellence, whether in sport or in art or in philosophy and science. Poets and dramatists competed for prizes and entered into contests, into the Olympiads, which included recitations of literary works. The better families sent their children off to be instructed by philosophers, not judged so much to be wise men as to be learned in the art and the science of the arts, in the art and science of rhetoric, for example. Aristotle tells us in his own treatise on the subject of rhetoric that of all of the aspects of rhetoric that render it most effective, that which renders it most effective of all is the perceived standing of the speaker himself. And this, I say, does finally get to the heart of that common sense realism that surfaces and occasionally abounds in the ancient Greek world. When all is said and done, the ancient Greek is inclined to look at that which seems to approximate an ideal, a perfection ever more closely, as something to be prized, even when one doesn't quite understand it, and even when one might find in it something pernicious or even dangerous. Again, there is this perfectionist feature in ancient Greek thought and life, surfacing in the art and architecture of the period, but also in the science and philosophy and mathematics of the period. We do have the picture of often poorly nourished, overworked, pimply, orthopedically disordered persons looking up at statues done by Polyclitus and Phidias and seeing the exemplification of divine perfection. They honor and revere it. These are not statues of the average Greek citizen, but intimations of the possibilities available to lives that aspire to perfection itself. Perfectionism has worked its way through Western civilization, and even in its current and tarnished form, is exemplified by achievements, and it's always risky to single out an achievement, but by such achievements as the space program, for example, where you have to put together the greatest intelligences and technical sophistication in engineering and physics, theoretical science, along with astronauts whose bodies have been conditioned for the task they confront. And this utter integration of confidence and science, medical examinations, gymnastics, courage and virtue come together and result in what? Mere Homo sapiens trotting upon the dust of the moon. This is as much a reflection of what Hellenism bequeathed as anything we can find today.